Well, welcome everyone to this panel. I am very happy that the panelists were able to join us because I think this is an important topic, talking about incidents that occur to critical infrastructure and the general cybersecurity of critical infrastructure. Because there is a difference when it comes to, for example, IT infrastructure, IoT infrastructure, industrial IoT infrastructure, and operational technology critical infrastructure. So to begin with this, and please feel free to jump in, what do you see as some of the main challenges to cybersecurity in critical infrastructure?
So Chris, I'd like to kind of sort of jump in, I guess, initially on that. Because of the need to have stability and reliability within critical infrastructure, inserting any kind of either new and protective technologies or even just making any kind of changes in general can be very challenging. Because you have to take things, potentially offline to be able to implement changes, things like that. And critical infrastructure is just that. It is so critical to an operational environment, to a city or a large entity or anything like that. Taking them offline to be able to implement any level of type of protective capabilities or technologies has risk to operations, risk to the bottom line. So I think that's one of the things I would say is one of the biggest challenges there. That and, right behind that, the fact that there's still a lot to be learned around threats targeting critical infrastructure versus targeting a standard traditional IT enterprise. That, what is the right approach to be able to, protect these in a measured, risk managed kind of a way?
Definitely.
The one thing I would add is also what is the definition of critical infrastructure, right? That's something that is, I think, changing right in front of us. I mean, today, just this week, we've seen an attack on, a meat packing company, right? And is that, the people are concerned about, price of food and so on. So I think one of the things is the definition of critical infrastructure itself is changing. And I think, some of the companies that maybe historically have not thought of themselves as tech savvy and therefore cybersecurity savvy are now being forced into this idea that, if they are not protecting the infrastructure well enough, then they are very much a target. So, I'd add that to what Tom already touched on.
I think if I could add something here to what the team here discussed, I think the major issue here is if we break the critical infrastructure, as we call it, into two parts, greenfield and brownfield. In a greenfield, we need a lot of attention from multiple parties. And then even if we implement some controls, it's not going to be valid for a long time. And the change is really, really expensive. You cannot just go ahead and change portions of, let's say, some PLCs that, we had some CVEs or some vulnerabilities went public. Then we take the other side where it's a brownfield and it's already been working. Some of these plants were operating since 1975, 1965, and they're still producing. So going in there and adding some sort of, let's call it maybe modern controls into a very legacy systems. Some of these systems cannot handle anything like that. We had a lot of challenges going on in my previous job. And of course, currently we view a lot of critical infrastructure. And it seems the challenge is not just in the Middle East or not just in Saudi Arabia where I'm based, but it seems it's a worldwide challenge. It's really, really hard to go ahead and just implement simple changes to a system that's already been stressed to the point that not a single downtime is allowed. So taking that from that perspective, then taking like vendors, taking controls of the system, you cannot just go ahead and change anything without getting into issues of violating the support contracts and things like that, which really, really delays any kind of, now we're just talking from kind of protective cycle, but even from a detection and identification. So the whole thing, if we take it like through the whole thing, even the identification is really problematic, because even you cannot just go ahead and use some kind of tool to go ahead and identify the assets in the plants. So it's a long answer, but I think we can even expand on this.
Oh, definitely. It's a bit of a quagmire, because more and more things like different types of IT equipment and IoT, industrial IoT, as well, as being added into these control systems. And we're seeing a lot of this, especially in the Middle East, because the proliferation of 5G is so much more here than in some areas of the world, even the West. You want to be able to get polling data out. Your salespeople want to see what's going on. Other facets of your organization want to see what's going on. And in many cases, you don't want to give them direct access because it could harm things. But here, industrial IoT and 5G is being able to open all of these doors, but introduce things where there is a mismatch. Say your traditional operational technology is meant to go in and could last 20, 30, 40 plus years. And if it isn't broken, don't fix it. But now you're putting in things that are expected to be replaced every 3 to 5 years, and to be patched and changed, and might no longer be interoperable. Now, when we start mixing more and more of this new with the old, what do you see as some of the ultimate impacts that could occur if some of these operational technology and control networks were to fail due to a cyber incident?
So Chris, that's a great question. And I guess one of the things that I'd like to just sort of, on the discussion we had just a few moments ago, that I think is relevant to this right here. And that is when we were looking at what is really kind of defining what we call critical infrastructure. The world has, for the past, 15 plus months, been dealing with this global pandemic, and it has changed everything that we do. How we work, where we work, how we collaborate, how we learn, how we get healthcare, how we live. And I think what that has done is it has forced a broader perspective on what, as a society, as a sovereign nation, has to be considered critical infrastructure. The ability to be able to get to a food supply, the ability to have clean water. In parts of the world, the ability to be able to have electricity that can run cooling systems and building management systems, things like that. So all of those are really part of that aperture now that we could label as critical infrastructure. The question about the impact, and particularly as you introduce new types of technologies and controls on top of layers of technologies and controls and processes that have been in place for, in many cases, decades, really creates a unique set of problems, I think. The impact can be, like you described, is there an interoperability issue or something along those lines that has to be taken into account, number one. Number two, there is just simply at the end of the day, as people leverage new infrastructure like 5G, like you described, there's a lot of these technologies and processes that are critical to sovereignty that can leverage that kind of new infrastructure, that kind of high-speed technology, that kind of availability that something like 5G advertises. But there has to be a transitional leap moving into a space where you can take that on. So I think to the question about impact, the impact is on an organization is going to have to, I think, results in a set of thought processes and decisions that have to be made as to, all right, so what investments are we going to make? What changes are we going to have to make organizationally in order to be able to actually move into the next generation? When we talk about generational shifts in families, how are we going to make the generational shift in this infrastructure and technology family to allow for a longer lifespan for the things we need to be able to do? I think that's going to be a big part of that. I also think that as a result of that, that actually presents for the cyber threat actor a new target plane to be able to take advantage of. We talked about, recent cyber attacks. One of the most ones I talked about here in the U.S. Over the last 48 hours was a ransomware attack on a ferry system around Martha's Vineyard in the New England area. Now, are the vessels able to operate? Yeah, absolutely. Are people able to schedule their time and get seating on these vessels right now to be able to go to work or transit? They're not. That's a direct impact that has to be taken into consideration. So I think the impact is organizations, nations are going to have to make some critical decisions about just an overall effort towards modernization to be tied to the new way of doing business.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I guess.
Sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Yes, so if I may add to this, if we look at maybe parts of the historic attacks that we've seen in the industrial control systems or in the critical infrastructure, there's things that are really sophisticated with IT, OT, like a modular attack, something like Stuxnet that goes ahead and use multiple 0 days to reach its target, identify its target, and then have its ICS payload. But then we see something like the initial attack that happened on the Ukraine, where somebody used something like a remote access tool just to go ahead and manipulate these relays. And then in the middle, we see something like a Trisis, where an attacker managed to write this payload that goes ahead and disable safety systems. So I guess the connectivity, more connectivity means more attack surface that can be used by low-skill attackers. Currently in the region, I don't think any, or maybe in the world, we haven't seen anything that's proven to go ahead and create some kind of, no adversary has been able to create something like a Stuxnet, something that's modular, that goes ahead, reaches its target, and use its payload. Everything else that we've seen so far is low skill, or maybe like something that works in IT, but it's not going to work in OT. So I guess more connectivity means more attack surface, more low skill adversaries, and more of IT-based risks will slip into the industry control system spectrum.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, Chris, I think about impact in kind of at two levels, right? One is kind of the impact of the actual attack. So, we've talked a lot about a few different attacks here, but, the one that is kind of resonates most with me was, some of the ransomware stuff last year where, I think we saw our first death that was, attributable to ransomware, right? So that's kind of a direct impact that you feel. I think the other thing that I think Tom touched on, which is really important, is the impact on us as a society as we start to think about, how do we tackle some of these big challenges, right? It's amazing how common, my kid yesterday was asking me, what is ransomware, right? I mean, it's not something that is just in the cyber realm anymore. It's something that is, just become part of our everyday jargon. And one of the things that has happened over the last year is this, digital transformation, 20 years of digital transformation in 20 months or in 20 weeks or what have you, right? And obviously, I think to the point that was just made, that has expanded the attack surface dramatically. I think we've seen IT, OT kind of boundaries, being softened up, if I may use those words, just because, you need to be able to, continue to operate, right? Even when you're operating remotely and so on. And all of that is kind of the other impact, right? Which is, how do we secure this new kind of model of operating? Because, as I think most people would tend to agree, it's not like we're going back into an office as if, it was back in February of 2020 anytime soon, right? I mean, I think the world has changed, and in some ways maybe for the better, but we've got to think about that impact as well.
Yeah, no, definitely. You raise a lot of good points. All of you do. How do you think that organizations should plan to avoid larger impact on their operations in general? One of the things that I've suggested in the past is, because even though ransomware might now be everyday jargon, cyber is still a bit too exotic for some places. And one of the things that I've advised is look at it as a risk strategy in your existing disaster recovery and business continuity planning, so that you insert that into things that are already existing and hopefully already being tested. What do you three think?
Yeah, I think you're right, Chris. I mean, if for better or worse, I guess some of the attacks in the last few weeks, anyways, have created that awareness, even in companies that maybe or organizations that have not historically been thought of as being at the forefront of cybersecurity, right? And I think one of the themes that seems to be, at least with our clients, it seems to be really resonating is this idea of business resilience. Because it's not just about cyber. There's a lot of other, the geopolitical tensions that sometimes result in resilience. There's certainly a big pandemic that happened over the last 12, 18 months that has affected how organizations think about resilience. And so it comes back to I think having processes in place to make sure that when or if such an attack hits you, how are you going to react? Do you have the right incident response processes in place? Do you have the right relationships with law enforcement? Do you have the right relationships with vendors, with intel agencies, with folks like that can help you kind of react to that very, very quickly, right? There's one thing that Kevin Mandia, who I think most of us have heard of, always says is like companies are not judged based on whether they get compromised or not. They're judged based on how they react after they've been compromised, right? And I think that's something that the boards, the executives really need to focus on.
Yeah, and I think one of the things, just to sort of expand on that point a little bit, when you're talking about an impact on an organization, the awareness across the organization is pretty darn critical. The challenges that are continuously evolving from a cyber threat perspective and targeting enterprises or targeting organizations or nations even, they're always at the forefront of learning and awareness for cyber professionals like us. But expanding the awareness of what can happen and what can challenge an organization from a cyber attack perspective pervasively throughout an organization, I think is critically important. A lot of, for example, a lot of ransomware attacks, aren't necessarily sophisticated. They tend to take advantage of sort of bulk distribution, for lack of a better term, and people will inadvertently open something, and inadvertently launch something within an organization, and they just either weren't aware, weren't thinking. They're, like we all do, multitask on different things. But, I think the changes that are going on and the biggest impact that has to happen on organizations now is just that understanding and awareness at all levels, at all layers, amongst all professions and practitioners. When we start to see that, and when we start to achieve that level of awareness, that's when we're going to actually start to see a change in the tide as it comes to how quickly an organization can respond and work through. Every organization at some point is going to deal with some sort of a cyber related issue. But I think the awareness and the training and the planning and the practicing of said planning that organizations do, and the broader they do it, is going to have the biggest impact on how well they're going to be able to drive their resiliency and operate through that kind of a compromise.
Sure, I have to agree with Mr. Goodwin here. It's cyber risk needs to be included in the risk that's being tracked in the critical infrastructure system. Yes, maybe something like a ransomware is not going to create any sort of lasting damage. It's going to be more of an annoyance versus something that's going to go ahead and cause some real damage to the infrastructure. But most of these infrastructure, let's say, even from an oil and gas perspective, have a reliance on the process before or the plant before. So there's some sort of cascading risk that people need, or companies need, to go ahead and now evaluate and make sure that it's calculated in their risk. For example, if you have a plant A that relies on a plant B that's relies on, it's a series of plants that rely on each other. So if you lose the first plant in the series, you lose everything. So sadly, we're in a big company that owns the whole supply chain from A to Z. The risk is more on them versus a smaller company. But the good thing is there is no nightmare scenario here. Even with multiple issues, even with the operators being blind, if something major happens, there's always these mechanical safety systems, these pressure relief valves, these blow down drums, flaring system that going to take care of it in a certain view. But if we don't go ahead and include these in the trainings and in the practice and go ahead and train on a loss of visibility type of attack, some sort of loss of control type of attacks, and make sure that we drill it into the operators' brains, people will end up making mistakes because mistakes are going to happen. And this is, I guess, one of the cases that was in a refinery in the U.S. In I think 2005 in Texas City, Texas, where a mistake happened there because they were not, or maybe they trusted the instruments more of what the instruments are supposed to give. And it ended up with a very sad and tragic situation. And the industry itself learns from mistakes like that, which is, I guess, the industry does not, the whole industry worldwide does not repeat the same mistakes. But the problem is right now with the connectivity, we've seen a lot of verticals. What happens in a refinery is not the same as an NGL plant. It's not the same in manufacturing. Every vertical needs to learn and needs to go ahead and drill it into the operators of what to do when it goes wrong. And the cyber risk need to be included in that.
Well, I think that's a very good point, because when I was an aircrew member in the U.S. Air Force, one of the things we trained on was if an incident occurred, how to manually do things, such as putting out fires in the engine. A pilot is taught that if you cannot trust your instruments, how to make sure that you can actually land without those instruments and do so safely. So we have simulations. There are certain things that occur that in the simulation training that if you don't know how to do manually, because it's such a high risk of an emergency and loss of life, then you're actually disqualified for a certain amount of time until you can get it into your head and you're drilled and drilled. Do you think that one of the challenges is because some organizations don't see an investment on return for the associated risks and associated costs for defense?
Yeah, Chris, I would absolutely agree with that, and I definitely appreciate the Air Force reference. Being former Air Force and former aircrew member myself, so appreciate that and your service. But you bring up an incredibly important point. Organizations, have often looked at, and it depends upon market segment that they're in, obviously, but organizations have often looked at cyber defense as more of a regulatory compliance exercise versus a how do I reduce the risk to my ability to be able to conduct business operations exercise. The regulated markets tend to drive this a little bit more proactively, whether it's financial services or healthcare, where you've got those kinds of compliance things that tend to drive some of the investment. I think though that organizations, if I could offer organizations and it doesn't really matter what industry they're in or what segment or anything like that, if I could offer any of them any kind of advice, it would be to understand what's the impact on their business, on their bottom line, on their people, if they're unable to operate, if they're unable to deliver to customers, whether it's a reputational risk, whether it's a direct revenue risk, anything like that. The impact on the bottom line is really something that organizations need to start taking a look at, and then at the same time also starting to measure, from a return on investment perspective, a small amount of investment in proactive protective measures tends to pay off greater dividends when it comes to having to be able to operate through a cyber challenged kind of an event. Looking at it from that perspective, I think is probably the more appropriate lens to use, so to speak. And I would just say, that's what, if I could offer any kind of advice to any organization, that's what I would recommend to them.
Yeah, I would say that, definitely kind of that cost avoidance model is definitely something that we're seeing more and more organizations kind of adopt, right? I think cybersecurity insurance or cyber risk insurance has a big role to play here, because as more companies kind of adopt that, we're seeing cyber insurance companies being in a very influential position to drive behavior, right? From a proactive, if you do these 5 things, we will reduce your premiums. And that's another way to kind of, measure, I'm not sure I'd call it really return on investment, but really, how are these proactive measures helping me drive, my costs down? I will say, my experience, Chris, and I'd love to hear what the rest of the panel thinks as well. If anything, I feel like in the Middle East, I've seen actually a much more bigger kind of adoption of some of these more proactive cybersecurity measures. I think there's some of the geopolitical aspects to it. There's some of the larger attacks that have occurred, et cetera. I definitely think that this is maybe an area where a number of organizations in the Middle East could pat themselves on the back as being very proactive and adopting, what we might consider, I don't know if advanced is the right word, but certainly, more cutting edge security mechanisms.
If I might add to this is maybe in the Middle East or maybe specifically in the GCC, most of the critical infrastructure is owned and operated by the government. So cost was not an issue when it comes to from day one. The plants are built with the top safety and security investment. So the money was not an issue. But if we break it into the multiple companies that are privately owned, they don't have the same type of investment. So for that, we say regulation. Regulation is good, but at the same time, regulation is only going to be followed from a compliance perspective. It's going to be minimal. So with the regulation, we should add some kind of maybe government incentives. So both the carrot and the stick here. For example, if we break the plants again into brownfield and greenfield, any kind of upgrade in the brownfield needs to fall into these compliance or regulatory standards. But then for the new field, you have to add some sort of cybersecurity or safety regulation that are added into the design perspective from 10%, 20%, all the way to 90% in commissioning. And these need to be tested because these, for example, one of the plants that actually I worked on during my previous job is it took about 10 years from design to commissioning. So a lot of things changed. We were talking about Windows. I remember we were talking about Windows 7 as being something advanced when we start that project, and then Windows 7 went out of commission by the time that project got commissioned. So periodic review and have some kind of moving target, not just regulatory that's the standard and that's what we got to follow all the way. No, we need to make sure that we follow and implement the changes that happen over the years.
So Nasser, if I could just add to what you're describing there, and I think a point you brought up is just so critically important, particularly when you're talking about the GCC area. Critical infrastructure, particularly in the GCC and the broader MENA region, is tied directly to national sovereignty. And they're operated by state-owned entities, and that brings about not only the appropriate of what I think is regulatory framework to help drive some of these things, but I think also I would just offer the perspective that, this is how we as a nation stand as an equal amongst all the other nations on the world stage by protecting this environment that sustains our sovereignty as an entity. For those organizations or even nations that don't have their critical infrastructure protection perspective seen as a tie to national sovereignty, whether through the regulatory environment, whether through anything else, I think that poses a bit of a challenge. I would offer that in that perspective, the GCC and the MENA region, but the GCC in particular, really kind of does lead world thought leadership in that regard. And I think that's an important thing to sort of call out and distinguish here.
Yeah, no, definitely. I remember when I was involved in the first Shamoon attack against Saudi Aramco, they couldn't build properly because their systems were down, but they wanted to get the countries moving and wanted to make sure that the oil markets were stabilized. And to do that, they needed to make sure that if people went to their local gasoline station, they didn't have a shortage. So what they did was they actually gave away the gasoline for free. And we saw the exact opposite with Colonial Pipeline, where it's now coming out that their control systems were not affected, but they slowed down and halted some of the production because their IT billing systems were down and they didn't want to lose money. So I think it does point out a very, very big difference between the GCC and how things are viewed for national sovereignty. Now, since we're coming towards the end, what sort of security measures would you recommend to try to minimize and possibly even mitigate future attacks and incidents against critical infrastructure as a whole?
I guess there is nothing that we know so far that can eliminate the risk. There is no control that can go ahead and, let's say, offer ultimate protection as a silver bullet. I think what we need is some sort of a holistic cybersecurity program in each one of these entities that goes ahead and offer everything from identification, detection. Because the major issue here is we cannot run if we cannot crawl. We went from these plants. I visited a lot of plants across the GCC, and we face the same problem. And it seems like this is a problem everywhere in the world. We cannot identify. We don't know what kind of assets we own. A lot of things changed. Some systems were here post upgrade, and it's still here for 10 years, and nobody knows what does it do. It's not connected anymore, but it's still there on the plant floor. So I guess it's taken the whole framework, going all the way from identify all the way to recover. And I'm talking about the NEST framework here. Things like that. We cannot take just a single control, I guess, that gonna save our life. And I'll leave the floor here since we got 5 minutes left. I know, Rodolfo, I think you're gonna say something.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think Nasser, you touched on really two things, right? One is, I think, just an awareness of your attack surface. I've got to tell you the story that Richard Clark, who I know is involved in this event as well, told me was, there was one case where they found, there was a vulnerable device and no one could find where that device was. Well, it turns out it was plastered behind a wall somewhere, right? And no one knew where it was because, well, it wasn't visible. But, I know that's kind of funny, but really, like, understanding your attack surface. And I think the other thing that I forget whether it was Tom or Nasser that brought it up earlier is just training, right? I mean, our layer 8 problem is not going away. And if we don't focus enough on, hey, don't click on those attachments, don't open those links. If someone's offering you $10,000 for doing nothing, it probably is not true. I think those are the two things I would say are probably most critical, right? Understanding the attack surface and then understanding your people attack surface, if you will, and then really focusing on those two. But yeah, there is no silver bullet. I guess all of us would be out of business if there was that one silver bullet.
Well, and I think, you guys have touched on a lot of really critically important points here. There's a number of different technological approaches that can be taken into account and implemented to try to mitigate attacks. Me personally, I'd welcome the opportunity. I'd welcome the day when we can actually have these kinds of things eliminated completely, because it frankly winds up that we have a much safer society as a result. Until we get to that point, it's it is focusing on things like the human layer and the human element and the training and awareness that I think is critically important. Number one. Number two, getting the message all the way up the leadership chain to the CEO, to the chairman of the board, everything, every owner in there, to the ministerial level, everything, to understand that cyber attacks have a direct impact from the ability to be able to execute the business or to prosecute the mission, however you want to describe it. When an organization, when an entity, when a nation stops having their ability to, or loses their ability to be able to trade in commerce, to be able to deliver services to the citizenry, to be able to deliver value to the shareholders, or to be able to protect their national sovereignty, that's when it becomes critically important to be focused on and addressing these things. And we need to make absolutely certain that as we drive awareness, as we understand what these challenges are, that the message is driven all the way to the very top levels of the leadership, and that it becomes a business or an entity or a national imperative to do it versus just simply a compliance exercise.
Excellent, excellent.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. If Oh man, just I think one of the key things that I learned over the years is from responding to incidents is every incident in the critical infrastructure ended up being uh, a, every incident in the that I responded to, even major incidents, was diagnosed as a mechanical issue or operational issue until somebody had the idea of let's look at it from a cyber perspective. I think if we keep looking, we'll find more. And I think that's my last thought on this. Thank you.
Yeah, we definitely need assistance discovering these types of things, because on the control floor, most people aren't going to think that it's cyber. So thank you very much, gentlemen. Hopefully the audience has prepared some questions, and we'll continue with those questions. Thank you.